Washington Journal continues.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative, and the joint resolution is passed.
And that was the Vice President Mike Pence, who broke a tie on the Senate vote that repealed a rule that would have made it easier for consumers to sue banks. And here to talk about that and the impact on the banking industry is Dennis Kelleher of Better Markets Incorporated. He is the president and CEO. Good morning.
How are you?
Can you tell us about this vote and why it matters?
So this matters actually to every American who has a checking account, a savings account, a credit card, a debit card, which basically means, Pedro, every American, right? So what this vote was all about was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau passed a rule. And the rule said that financial institutions cannot sneak in teeny-weeny print in the back of these long contracts that nobody reads every time they open a savings account or a checking account or a credit card. Way in the back, buried in there, it says, you, consumer, give up your consumer rights and you are forced to go into arbitration to settle any disputes. So unlike every other consumer in America, if you get injured by a glass or your car or you trip going out and other people do the same thing, you don't have to go up against a corporation all by yourself. You get to join with other injured consumers in what's called a class action, basically a lawsuit. You get to go to court, and in an open proceeding with rules, you get to have a lawyer who represents the class, and you can get compensation. What this CFPB rule said was that the financial companies cannot force you, the consumer, who's been ripped off, into these arbitration proceedings. You too, like every other American, can go to court and sue the bank. And what happened in Congress is the Republicans in the Trump administration said, no. The financial institutions want to keep you in arbitration. They want to force you into arbitration proceedings, which are secret, and they're biased, and they're unfair to consumers. And we know that because the financial institutions win virtually every single time in arbitration. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau said, we're not going to allow financial institutions to force ripped-off consumers into arbitration. We're going to let them go to court. The Republicans in the Senate and the House and the Trump administration said, no. The financial institutions don't like that. We're going to allow them to force you into court. So it took away consumers' rights to go to court and get relief.
The comptroller of the currency weighed in on this issue, and this is what he said. In part, he said the CFPB's own data shows that when consumers turn to arbitration, they receive higher settlements more quickly than they were forced to rely on class action lawyers to fight their case. And class action lawsuits often involve more claimants and may generate big headline settlement figures, but people making millions are the lawyers when the average individual payout for such suits is $32.
Yeah. You know, it really is laughable, these objections. So the OCC and the Republicans and every bank lobby in Washington said, arbitration is great for consumers. It's quick, it's cheap, it's easy, and you get a lot of money. Pedro, why do you have to force consumers into arbitration if it's so great, it's so easy, and you get a lot of money? If any of that was true, consumers would run into arbitration. They have to be forced into arbitration because those claims are simply not true. And as to the CFPB study, it did show, and this is one of the problems because what's the old saying? You know, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? Well, the study did show that actually if you looked at the very, very, very few people, consumers, who won an arbitration, they won more money. But almost nobody wins. So if you say 10,000 people go into arbitration and 2 people win $1,000, but 10,000 people go into class actions and 5,000 people win $100, who's better off? Well, this is the key. You're much better off in a class action because when 10,000 people lose $100, which is what happens in the financial institution, what happens is each consumer gets ripped off by 25, 50, or $100, right? To each consumer, it's not worth it to either sue or go to arbitration. But who's it worth it to? The financial institution, because when you get 25, 50, and $100 from 1 million or 200 people, you got tens of millions of dollars. So the other big downside of forcing consumers into arbitration, which basically means 99% of consumers who are ripped off will never get any compensation. That means the institutions get to pocket the money. So they're actually incentivized to rip people off. And even if they were incentivized, Pedro, there's no deterrence. Why would a financial institution that knows if it rips off its customers don't usually know, if they find out, they have no effective remedy, and the amount is so small, they're not a threat anyway. And that creates an upside-down incentive system and doesn't deter predatory conduct.
Let me invite the viewers to call in and ask questions of you, not only about this decision, but other issues when it comes to the Trump administration. Wall Street issues 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats and Independents, 202-748-8002. You can post questions or comments for our guest, Dennis Kelleher, on our Twitter site at CSPANWJ. And you can also post comments on our Facebook page at facebook.com/CSPAN. A little bit about Better Markets Incorporated and what it's about.
So we're a nonprofit, independent advocacy group. We represent the public interest in the financial markets. So, for example, when mostly Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, the biggest banks on Wall Street, are in Washington at the regulatory agencies of the administration, they're trying to bend the rules, laws, and policies to advantage their business, which they're entitled to do. It's America. They can come and lobby like anybody else. The problem is that there's nobody on the other side with the expertise to go in and represent the public interest and push back and be a counterweight to the private sector interests that are trying to increase their profits, as they're entitled to do. So what Better Markets does is it engages in rulemaking. We write research reports. We do a lot of advocacy across Washington, from the Congress to the administration to the rulemaking agencies, which are the SEC, the CFTC, and the Fed, and the Treasury, and elsewhere. And what we basically do is we fight for the consumers and investors in the public interest to make sure that their interests are the priority in Washington, and not Wall Street's lobbyists being the priority in Washington. They certainly should have a voice like anybody else, but their interests should not trump the public interest. And that's the big problem in Washington, is lobby dollars, campaign clout, which Wall Street has the most of, tends to dictate and determine what the policy outcomes in Washington are.
So is there a tie between what happened in the Senate and what you're claiming as far as the influence of lobbyists on this issue?
Absolutely. You know, if you look at who was on what side here, every single consumer protection agency in America was in favor of the Consumer Protection, Financial Protection Bureau's rule to protect consumers. Who was on the other side? Wall Street and every single big, powerful Wall Street lobbying and financial institution lobbying firm in America. In fact, you could have read one of the quotes earlier from the head of one of the biggest Wall Street lobby groups in Washington, saying, thank goodness this rule failed because it wouldn't have helped consumers. His whole job, his multi-million-dollar annual salary, depends upon promoting the interests of Wall Street. Nothing to do with consumers. And so when all these people, and this is one of the difficulties if you are out in America and you listen to this, you hear people say these things, but what you need to do is say, well, wait a minute, who are they really representing? And when they say arbitration is fair and easy and gets you lots of money, you have to say, well, why are consumers not using it? And why are consumer advocacy organizations not in favor of it? And oh, by the way, why are all the Wall Street lobbyists in favor of forcing financial consumers into arbitration? It's because it's not in their interest, it's in the financial institution's interest.
Let's go to some calls. Pikesville, Maryland, you're up first. Republican line. Nicholas, you're on with our guest, Dennis Kelleher of Better Markets Incorporated. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm not exactly sure of the role of the guest, but my question or comment regards overdraft fees. Banks routinely charge something like a $35 overdraft fee when indeed the amount of overdraft could only be as little as $5, yet they're going to charge a $35 overdraft fee. I find that obscene, and I'm assuming the reason why they can get away with it is because such a fee is not considered to be interest, rather something else. Can the guest comment on that, please?
Well, Nicholas, you're not alone in being outraged at overdraft fees. And frankly, every time you turn around, these financial institutions are adding on another fee, and you're getting nickeled and dimed to death. And those nickels and dimes add up to hundreds and thousands of dollars during a year. And the banks get away with it because for a couple of reasons. First of all, is consumers don't have much choice among the big financial institutions, and therefore consumers tend not to move from one bank to another. And it's a problem of kind of consumer choice and being locked in once you get into a bank and you have a credit card, a savings account, a checking account. The other thing is these fees sneak up on you. You don't see them at the time, you see them after the fact. But you're 100% right that these fees bear no relationship to the actual cost that a financial institution incurs. What they do is they're just padding their profits by moving money from your pockets into their pockets. And that's bad. I will say this, though, and people forget this. There are almost 6,000 banks in the United States. Only about 30 or 40 have more than $100 billion. The vast majority of banks in the United States are community banks. And community banks are much more responsive to their customers because they're much more grounded in your local community. And what I would say is you ought to be looking at your community banks and the smaller banks who tend to be more respectful of their customers and tend to want customer service and want their customers happy, unlike the local branch of a big, too big to fail bank that sits in Washington that's worrying about padding its profits to the maximum amount.
This is Vicky in Minnesota, Democrats line.
Hi. I did experience, I believe, some of that arbitration, and I was really not very educated on it. We lost our home to Wells Fargo back in the fall, the fall of the banks and all the people millions of people that lost their homes. We did go to court with Wells Fargo a few times. I spent 4 years trying to save our house that my boyfriend and I built. It was really intimidating going to court with the Wells Fargo's huge, rich lawyers. Who has a chance against them? A single little caregiver like me and my plumber boyfriend. The judge was really on our side. We did win the things that we won, but we ended up in an arbitration fight that we didn't even know we were in. They found our names in all the files. This group that sued Wells Fargo, and they put us into it, and we won. But there were a lot, thousands and thousands, and it was over, $1 to $2 million that we won, and we did get $1,300. We figured we probably lost $150,000 building our home. We built it from scratch in 2006, and that's when all the jobs failed. We went down to hardly any work, and we weren't able to save our home.
Okay, Vicki, thank you so much for telling your story.
Vicki's story, unfortunately, is way too common. When the financial crash happened in 2008, which was largely caused by high-risk, illegal, often criminal conduct by the largest financial institutions in this country, not only did 27 million Americans end up underemployed literally within months, but there were 16 million foreclosure filings in the United States over the next several years, and somewhere in the neighborhood, underwater homes where the mortgage cost more than you could sell it for reached almost 40% in terms of the effective underwater rate. So a lot of people ended up in the position that Vicki was in, where often through unemployment, losing their jobs and then losing their homes and often depleting their savings and everything else, you're in a position where when you're ripped off by a huge institution, a corporation, they have all the resources, they have an army of lobbyists, they have an army of lawyers. And so what often happens is people say, all by myself, I have to go into my bank account, take some money, hire some lawyers, take the risk, and figure out how can I beat this army on the other side all by myself. And that's why class actions are so incredibly important in this country, because what they enable people like Vicki to do is join with other people who have been hurt similarly by big corporations and financial institutions. And essentially the class action is they don't have to pay for the lawyers. Class action lawyers actually represent the class of injured consumers. And they go to court and they sue. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. But this is the important thing, Pedro, is the members of the class don't pay the lawyers. The lawyers only get paid in the class action if they recover enough money that the court, in a separate hearing, decides they're entitled to any money. So it may be the case that many people in the class don't get big dollars, but they but when they recover, they get more than zero, which is what they would have got otherwise. And none of that goes to pay for the lawyers. The lawyers get paid by a determination of the court as the amount of the settlement. And so Vicki's story has a good ending. She did get some recovery, and that's good. And that is often the case in class actions. It's virtually never the case in forced arbitration, because in arbitration, there's no class. You've got to hire a lawyer, and you are forced alone to fight the financial institution and their army of expert lawyers. That's why you never win in arbitration, or virtually never win.
Let's go to Kurt in Newcastle, Indiana, Democrats line.
My question is, do you know when the last time banking institutions had their charter revoked?
Good question. I actually don't know that. I can't think of when it happened, and it is, boy, it's pretty rare. But you bring up a very good point, Kurt, which is when financial institutions engage in outrageous, egregious, predatory, illegal, and criminal conduct, the biggest banks on Wall Street do it. We've all seen the headlines, month after month after month. And it's one more slap on the wrist settlement. And sure, it says they have to pay billions of dollars. Well, first of all, they almost never pay the billions at the headline number. It's always inflated. The regulators, the prosecutors, and the banks have this kind of self-interest to inflate those numbers to basically deceive the American public. Regulators want you to think they're being tough on Wall Street, and Wall Street wants you to think that they're being punished. Neither of that is true, because it happens over and over again. And so the question is anybody being deterred here? You know, if you're a community bank and you do something wrong, they throw the book at you. If you rob a 7-Eleven, if you take $100 from a 7-Eleven, they throw the book at you. But if you're one of the biggest banks in the country on Wall Street, you're what they call too big to jail. You're too big to regulate, you're too big to jail, and you're too big to fail. So they go light on you, and you get to do it over and over again. It's past time that regulators, prosecutors, and elected officials start thinking about very serious, meaningful sanctions on these banks, like revoking their charter. But even more importantly, I would say, Kurt, let's start prosecuting individual bankers. 2008 was the biggest financial crash in this country since the Great Crash of 1929. It caused the worst economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s. How many bankers went to jail from big, powerful Wall Street banks? Zero. Zero. Well, it cannot be the case, and I said this to the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District, and I've said it to the SEC and other people who are supposed to be prosecuting and regulating this. It cannot be the case. It can't be the case that we have the biggest crash since 1929. There's a loss of trillions and trillions of dollars. It was based on a predatory subprime lending scandal, and they could not find one person on Wall Street who broke the law, not one. Well, they're either not looking, or they're so grossly incompetent they should be fired or quit.
Let me go to Sadie in California, Republican line.
Good morning. Yes, I have a question. I've been part of these little mini class actions many, many times over the years, and I get these little things in the mail, and I sign it and send it back. And I've seen some of the smallest checks I've ever seen, 87 cents when it finally comes to fruition. But I'm a lawyer. I read through all this stuff, and the amount of the attorney's fees is mind-boggling. It is staggering that I almost feel that it is a scam, and I have no idea how those fees are earned. I don't delve into it, but the people who are really affected absolutely get nothing. So to me, it's a great decision then.
Well, you raise a very good point. And let me be clear. Not all class actions either win, not all class actions win a lot of money, and not all class actions are meritorious. And I don't mean to suggest any of that. And you're right, there's some, and I don't know whether or not that's because of the strength of the case or the weakness of the case in the particular example that you had, or whether it's because it was an abuse of the class action process. I don't know. But I will say this, that, and there's no question that there are abuses in the class action process, and there are times when people don't recover anything or recover small amounts, and that happens too often. And when it does, one of the problems is often the lawyers still get a lot of money, and it causes people to be mad. Well, then what we should do is address those problems in the process. What we shouldn't do is say to ripped off consumers, you're actually going to effectively have no ability to recover anything, which is what forced arbitration means. So there's two things that really could be done. We could fix the arbitration process so that consumers actually see that It actually is unbiased, it is fair, it's low cost and effective. We could fix that. Or we could fix the class action process by getting rid of and policing those cases where the lawyers get gazillions of dollars and consumers either get a coupon or 87 cents. And the likelihood of fixing the arbitration process is almost non-existent because it's a private proceeding and individuals have to go up against banks by themselves. The better thing to do is to fix the class action process so that those cases, however small they may be, where there are abuses and consumers don't get relief, that those are minimized so that people can get the benefits of the class action.
Our guest, Dennis Kelleher of Better Markets Incorporated. He's the president and CEO, bettermarkets.com, the website if you want to check it out for yourself. North Charleston, South Carolina, Democrats line. Jay is next.
Yeah, good morning. How's everybody doing?
Hi, Jay.
I have to be honest, C-SPAN did it once again, man. The number one news media outlet because they bring a lot of these facts that mean so much to us. I have two questions. The first one is Mike Pence cast a deciding vote to basically overturn this. I want to do some investigation, and maybe someone can about, what interest he may have in this. And number two, I'm going to write down your website because it's paramount. I have to get in contact with somebody like you or you because it's just so much more information that I can draw from you. And I'm sorry, last but not least, you are right. I'm going to close on this. I'm definitely going to do some research on when a bank has ever got their charter.
Okay. Apologies. They lost the call. Sorry.
Sorry, Jay. Well, I'll thank you on behalf of Pedro and C-SPAN, but you're right. It's one of the best shows on all of TV, and everybody should watch it. First of all, our website's www.bettermarkets.com, and we've got a lot of information not only about the arbitration rule, but basically about everything related to finance and the economy, and particularly how Wall Street's trying to influence Washington and how we're fighting back. Regarding Pence, Vice President Pence doing the deciding vote, one of the things people have forgotten is that candidate Donald Trump ran as the most anti-Wall Street candidate since Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. He talked about Wall Street as a danger to the American people over and over again. And he said you shouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton because Hillary Clinton is in the pocket of Wall Street. And when Hillary Clinton gets to Washington, she's going to bring all those bankers and put them in her administration, not candidate Donald Trump. And what we've seen is the biggest flip-flop in history. So candidate Donald Trump is anti-Wall Street. President Donald Trump has embraced Wall Street in a way that's unimaginable. He's effectively merged the White House with Wall Street. The president of Goldman Sachs is now President Trump's chairman of the National Economic Council. He runs the national economic policy for the United States. And so it shouldn't surprise anybody that Vice President Pence would go up to the Senate and cast a deciding vote to deliver to Wall Street one of its biggest wins in decades, at a time when the American people voted for a candidate who said not only wouldn't he do that, but that he was going to do the opposite of that. And so the American people should focus on not what people in Washington are telling them or what they're going to do. And what we've seen happen here is a slap in the face for the American people. Not only did the president embrace Wall Street, but now consistently he's voting against the interest of Main Street, slapping consumers, forcing them to lose their rights, and discriminating against them, effectively saying you can't even have the same rights as every other American consumer.
Oh, well, we got you here. The president is expected to name the next head of the Federal Reserve, and one of the papers highlights this morning could be a current governor, Jay Powell,
right.
Could be John Taylor from Stanford University. Who should be the next chair, and what do you think about the names that have been filtering around already?
Well, I think if I said who should be the next chair, that would guarantee he would not get picked, or he or she would not get picked. So I'm not going to do that. But I think there are some very strong candidates and with very different views and very different paths for the president, and who knows what he's going to do. It was reported most recently over the weekend that current Governor Jay Powell was, in the lead now in this kind of crazy horse race that the president has ginned up here by constantly dribbling out information. I know Governor Jay Powell, he's a conservative Republican, but I will say he is, I think, would be a very effective Fed chair. You know, the chairmen, although they seem to be powerful, they still only have one vote, and it's a consensus-driven organization with an incredibly talented professional staff that you have to get the support of. And therefore, you need somebody who can work well with others, including in particular others who don't necessarily share your view. And that's Jay Powell, and that's a number of the others. On the other hand, one of the other leading candidates is reported to be Professor Taylor, who is the author of, surprisingly, the Taylor Rule, which is a very mechanistic way of looking at Fed policy and how you determine interest rates, which, by the way, affect every single American. No matter what you do in America, you're affected by the Fed policy, and you actually have a stake in this. So Mr. Taylor has a very mechanistic approach to these things. It's almost like he wants to put Fed policy on autopilot, as if you were flying from Washington, D.C. to London, and you're on autopilot. You know, and that works fine until a hurricane comes up the Atlantic. When a hurricane comes up the Atlantic, you really want to be able to go off autopilot and take into account. The Taylor Rule is very good, or arguably good and useful, when you're on autopilot and nothing else is happening. But if you get hit by a hurricane, for example, like the 2008 financial crash, or even other things like 9/11, what you really need is discretion and judgment for the professionals to exercise to make sure the country economically is in the right place.
How would you gauge Janet Yellen's position and what she's done in the position?
Well, I think Janet Yellen has done a pretty good job, having been dealt a pretty bad hand. And I think one of the things that is not talked about that should be a big factor in this decision is people talked about the response of former Chairman Ben Bernanke to the financial crisis in 2008 and how he had to face the Fed, him in particular, but the Fed in general, unprecedented circumstances nobody's seen in this country since 1929. And they had to be very entrepreneurial and think very differently and have a lot of discretion and try a lot of different things and be open-minded. But I will say this, what nobody's talking about is getting out of those positions, which is where we are now. We have effectively zero interest rates, and we have $3 trillion balance sheet at the Fed. Well, interest rates before the crisis were 3 to 4%, and the Fed balance sheet was about $600 to $800 billion. So what the Fed is now confronted with is how it unwinds these emergency measures 9 years later. But these are as unprecedented as the crash was in 2008. And you would think you would want somebody who's got some perspective and history, having got to where we are today, to figure out, because it's unprecedented, how we get out of these incredibly large policy decisions that are going to affect interest rates, employment, growth, and the economy generally over the next 5 to 10 years. So I think Chair Yellen has done a very good job, and is the most informed person in terms of thinking hard and long about how we got to where we are and how we get out of where we are.
Dennis Kelleher, the president and CEO of Better Markets Incorporated, bettermarkets.com, the website. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
In our Your Money segment, we're going to take a look at your 401k and other retirement savings programs, how those could be affected by tax reform. Our guest, Douglas Fisher of the American Retirement Association.